Hello, and welcome to the Gallimaufry, a hodgepodge history podcast. My name is Will, and with me, as always, is my co-host Nick.
Hello. Yes, although I'm not actually with you. I've managed to escape from the carpet shop. But funny enough, it kind of fits the theme of our episode, which is about betrayal, abandonment, being set adrift.
Yeah, I'm feeling a lot of this right now. But before we announce what we're going to be speaking about in today's podcast, why don't we set the tone?
So this week, we're going to be talking about one of the most famous mutinies in history, the mutiny on the HMS Bounty in 1789. It was a Royal Navy expedition that went a little wrong.
To discuss the history of the Bounty and the mutiny, we first need to start with a character called Joseph Banks. Basically, he was a botanist in the late 18th century. He's probably best known, I would say, for his part in the formation of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. He was also president of the Royal Society for over 41 years, and he's also credited with bringing over 30,000 plant specimens home from his various expeditions.
He didn't do much then.
No, I mean, gardener, you know. When he wasn't rearranging the gnomes or digging the water feature, Joseph Banks had been on several expeditions with another famous character called Captain James Cook on his ship, the Expedition, out to Tahiti. And it was on Tahiti that they found a plant which was called the breadfruit. The breadfruit is, sort of a large fruit. It's quite sort of nutritious. It was easy to grow. And it was meant to have a flavour similar to that of cooked bread.
That sounds amazing. I mean,
yeah.
Can I get these? Can I buy these somewhere?
I did go to my local supermarket and see if I could find a breadfruit, but they didn't have any. So obviously Joseph Banks, his local Tesco didn't have it in stock. So he decided breadfruit would be the ideal food source for, they were having trouble feeding their slaves, and breadfruit seemed like the ideal food source. So he, after much nagging at the Admiralty, he managed to put together an expedition where a ship would sail to Tahiti. They would collect the breadfruit plants and they would then bring them to Jamaica, where they'd be planted and used to feed the slaves. The voyage they came up with, they didn't consider it particularly high priority. It was a small vessel with a small crew.
And I believe this is where our friend William Bligh comes in, because he was the person selected to be in charge of the voyage.
Yes, so William Bligh is one of our two main characters. He was born near Plymouth. He was the son of a customs officer, and he is quickly involved in the Navy. The first records we have of him are as a captain's servant when he was 7 years old. He later becomes midshipman as an adult. He works on several ships, eventually working under the same Captain James Cook that we mentioned earlier on his expedition to Tahiti. Bligh is actually present when James Cook is murdered by a group of angry natives on Hawaii.
That's actually quite a character-forming experience for him, isn't it? Because basically he's seeing his boss and mentor literally murdered in front of him. I mean, I've read that kind of helped shape how he dealt with people and how he perceived events going forward.
Yeah, one of the things that Bligh really took away from this experience was the crew's failure to protect their captain. And he felt that was a real betrayal of the captain, that they should have stood by him and protected him.
It's not really something to feel about. That is a betrayal. He's basically saying, right, you're in danger, bye.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I don't know what their justification for it was.
Probably not wanting to die as well. That's a pretty strong motivator for most people.
Yeah, but Bligh was a fastidious log taker, and he recorded all of this. He took very detailed journals. After Cook's death, he's lost some influence. He hasn't got his friend in high places anymore, and he starts to be a little bit marginalised. So he goes home. He takes a holiday, which is apparently quite unlike Bligh. He's a bit of a workaholic. He gets married to a lady called Elizabeth Betham. She's the daughter of an influential family from the Isle of Man.
Just to stop you there, I think that says something about his character, that in order for him to, I guess, find love and get married, he has to take a break from work.
Yeah, I mean, he had many flaws, but you couldn't say he wasn't dedicated to his job. So he goes back to sea to support his family. He goes on several more voyages until Elizabeth's uncle is able to get him assigned to this new voyage that Joseph Banks
This
is
is where the
setting up.
story of the mutiny on the Bounty really begins, because it set sail in 1787 with 46 crew on board. And what's interesting about the ship is that it's a refitted collier, which is basically an old cargo ship, and they turn it into a cutter. But what's unique about the ship is that they had to sort of refit it into a botanical garden area. So on board the crew are actually two botanists. And this is obviously to help cultivate the breadfruit, make sure it survives the voyage. But what's interesting about this is that it makes the ship very, very cramped. So it's not a large ship to begin with, and you've got 46 people all sharing a space. And this is perhaps one of the facets of what led to the revolt, because everyone is basically living and breathing each other all the time. And you've got a very, very long voyage that somehow doesn't go exactly to plan. So what happens when they set sail, Will?
The Admiralty don't feel that this sailing is much of a priority, so they hold off giving the go-ahead. So the Bounty is stuck at Spithead for a long time, and Bligh is getting more and more frustrated that he's going to miss the good winds. When they finally give the go-ahead, the weather is terrible from the get-go. They sail down towards Cape Horn. They do stop off at the Canaries, which must have been quite nice, stock up on some duty-free. And then they continue to Cape Horn. The weather is terrible and it's getting worse. And they're really struggling. They're making no progress at all. Bligh is adamant that they must go round the Horn. The men are really suffering. And he pushes on and on and on until eventually he gives in and he says, right, fine. We're going to call it off. We're going to go round the Cape of Good Hope, around the bottom of Africa.
This is another facet to probably what caused the mutiny was Bligh himself, his personality, his stubbornness, and his unwavering desire to stick to his strict rules, strict schedule.
He was quite sort of a pig-headed man. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He wouldn't take advice from others. It was his way. And he said they were going around the Cape Horn, and that's what they were going to do. Bligh, up until now, had really set the tone. He had been very strict. He'd insisted on the ship being kept very, very clean, on the men being clean. He had sort of he demanded that they dance every night.
So hang on. I can understand the cleanliness because of the close living conditions, but dancing every night.
So this was apparently something which Bligh had picked up on his time with Cook. I'm not sure there are any records of Cook forcing his men to dance, but this was something that Bligh believed was good for the men. It was good for their health and their well-being. So for 2 hours every night, the men would dance. He actually brought a musician with him specifically to play the violin, and they would dance.
Sorry, how did they like dance together in pairs? Was it like waltzing, or was it like just a sailor's jig? Was it interpretive dance?
I imagine a lot of elbow swinging, a lot of knees up, a lot of yo-ho-ho. I don't know. I mean, it's up to your interpretation. Maybe I like to think they were maypole dancing, around the mast with ribbons and things. But however, they were forced to dance, but the crew really grew to dislike it, and it was just another source of tension. And of course, the whole fiasco with Cape Horn meant that the crew lost confidence in Bligh as the captain as well. Right from the get-go, people are not entirely happy.
And Bligh did nothing to aid this situation. As we mentioned, he was quite a prickly character.
He was very good with his words, He apparently had a much larger vocabulary than we already thought. As it turns out, he did love to swear as well. So while he was not physically abusive to his staff, he definitely didn't hold back verbally.
And despite the failure at Cape Horn, they do eventually make it to Tahiti, where they basically get the chance to have a little break from each other and go ashore and actually see people.
Yes, so 26th October 1788, and we're looking at, about 10 months after they set sail from England. They finally make it to Tahiti. The record showed that the Tahitians were known for being very attractive. The women used to sort of casually go topless, and they're greeted with this sort of swarm of these people. And you can kind of imagine how they reacted to that. This group of sort of young men who have been all stuck together for this long. Bligh, the diligent worker he insists they get on with the job at hand, that they start the plantation. They start the nursery, and they grow the breadfruit plants, and they get them ready to load on the ship so they can go to Jamaica. While this is happening, he allows the crew onto the shore, and they mingle with the Tahitians, and they have quite a good time of it as well.
Yes, they enjoyed themselves quite profusely. They got drunk. They met women there. Some of them end up becoming their girlfriends in the time that they're staying there and nursing the plants. And in fact, this is where our other great protagonist, or rather antagonist, appears in the story, and that's Fletcher Christian, who, while during the voyage, actually gets promoted by Bligh. He becomes the acting lieutenant of the ship after Bligh demoted his other, more experienced acting lieutenant, John Fryer.
Yeah, now Christian and Bligh, they actually have a bit of history together. Christian had sailed under Bligh on previous voyages, and Christian was quite a bit younger. He was in his early 20s at this point. And Bligh had sort of taken him under his wing. He'd taught him about navigation, and he saw Christian as quite a promising sailor. Christian had apparently met Bligh's family. He'd met their children. This was something that gets brought up later. But Christian gets sent off to oversee the nursery on the island, and while he's away, suddenly him and the group of men he's with, they're not cramped in a little cabin. They have Tahitian women. They are not under the direct control of Bligh anymore, and they get used to that lifestyle. They're there for several months.
It's important to not understate how unique a character Bligh was, because he could be very, very difficult. Although he was kind to Christian and made him his acting lieutenant, he also belittled him in various little ways, like little remarks here, yelling at him for small, tiny errors. He also lent Fletcher Christian money and then would hang it over his head.
There's a famous incident of Bligh has a store of coconuts on the boat for himself, and he sees some are missing, and he blames Christian for stealing them. He's quite thin-skinned, so when who he thinks is his mentor and his friend is accusing him of sort of a petty theft of some coconuts, it really doesn't go down well.
You've got these three things now. You've got terrible conditions on the boat. You've got the personality of Captain Bligh, who, although he's a fantastic sailor, he's not a people person. And then on top of that, you've got the fact that they've just been dropped off on a tropical paradise with a bunch of incredibly attractive women. As we mentioned, Bligh keeps meticulous diaries. So when it came down to him recalling why the revolt happened, he thought it was solely, and wrongly, because he probably wasn't evaluating how he was around people, but he put it solely down to the island. He said, "It will very naturally be asked what could the reason for the revolt be, in answer to which I can only conjecture that the mutineers had assured themselves of a more happy life among the Tahitians than they could possibly have had in England."
I think it's very easy to look at all this and think of Bligh as kind of a tyrant, but there is an incident on Tahiti where 3 of the crew attempt to desert, and they're found 2 weeks later. And in the Navy at the time, the penalty for desertion was to be hanged, and Bligh, he chose not to have them hanged. One of them was flogged, one was put in irons, and the other one was just given a stern talking to. It kind of shows another side of Bligh. What was he? Was he lenient? Did he choose not to hang them because he didn't feel that was right? Or perhaps he simply thought he had a small crew and what he thought was an important job to do, and he couldn't afford to lose 3 men.
But despite these failings, he was a remarkably gifted seaman. Because once the ship finally leaves Tahiti, and that happened on April the 4th, 1789. And it would only take 24 days later for the ship to mutiny. Some 1,300 miles away from Tahiti, Fletcher Christian makes his move with a bunch of crewmen. In fact, in total, it was 25 petty officers and seamen seized the ship with him. Bligh actually had more people on his side. Despite this imbalance, Bligh still ended up being set adrift with 18 of his colleagues in a 23-foot longboat, which is not a lot, which is not a big boat at all for the amount of people shoved in it. And in fact, people who sided with Bligh were restrained from being put into the boat because they just wouldn't fit. And Fletcher Christian ended up commanding the boat.
Do you know what the saddest thing about the mutiny was? They threw all the breadfruit into the sea.
Why would you do that?
I know.
You could eat it.
They could. Yes. I think the breadfruit situation was sort of a source of contention as quite a lot of the living space had to be given up for these 1,015 breadfruit plants.
Well, that is sad. But what is a sad story of cramming all these men into this longboat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which is basically a death sentence, was that they survived by amazing seamanship. He managed to basically sell this boat to the East Indies after a voyage of around 3,600 miles. I mean, that's just incredible. Although, annoyingly for him, along the way there was another mini mutiny, which he managed to put down this time.
When they're left adrift, they're given 5 days of rations, and during this whole thing, only one man dies, and he's killed by natives on an island that they land on.
So when they actually went to Tahiti, it was only the third time any Europeans had visited those islands. And then he was sailing basically near and around Fiji, which was completely unexplored, until they ended up in Indonesia and Timor.
Yeah, to be honest, I have enough trouble just going on the Isle of Wight ferry, let alone thousands of miles of open water in the Pacific. He brings the men to a Dutch East Indies port in Indonesia. After recuperating, he finds travel on a Dutch ship back to England.
When he returns to England, he's actually court-martialed, but he gets acquitted because obviously he's lost a boat, so you're not doing your job very well. But he gets acquitted, and then he does eventually actually get to transport breadfruit to the West Indies some years later when he gets given another commission on board a ship called the Providence. And this is even sadder than when obviously the mutineers on the Bounty threw the breadfruit overboard. When they finally get the breadfruit to the West Indies, the slaves refuse to eat it. They don't like it. So the whole expedition was utterly pointless.
I mean, to be fair, Bligh did his job. He did his job twice.
Yeah, he did it quite well.
You do notice in a lot of sort of the writing about this story, the focus does seem to be more on the mutineers and Fletcher Christian. I think Bligh is probably a more interesting character when you really look into him, though.
Exactly why we focused on him more than Fletcher Christian. But now that you've mentioned Fletcher Christian, shall we move on to what happened to the mutineers after they managed to seize control?
Fletcher Christian has taken charge. He decides that they're going to sail to Tahiti. Sort of makes sense. They had a nice time there. So they go back to Tahiti and they collect some people. They collect women and they collect a small group of men. And then they decide this isn't a good hiding spot. We need to go somewhere more remote. So they sail away with the Tahitians still on board. Some say the Tahitians were effectively tricked into coming with them. Some say it was voluntary. They sail off and they try and find a place to hide. They sort of bounce between islands. They tend to get chased off by the natives, who aren't anywhere near as friendly as the Tahitians. Eventually, Christian finds Pitcairn Island. They sail to shore. They realise this is quite a good place to stay. And to make sure that they can't be spotted, they set fire to the Bounty. So they're all there. They're trapped. There's nowhere to go. There's no boat. They're all there on Pitcairn Island. The mutineers, the Tahitian men and women. The mutineers decide that they're going to take a wife each from the Tahitian women. And the Tahitian men are left with the rest to share among themselves. There's around 9 Tahitian men with them on the island, and there's about 5 women left over. So you can see maybe there was a certain amount of resentment that the 9 Tahitian men are forced to share 5 wives among themselves. But nonetheless, they carry on.
I mean, what about the women? No one's thinking about the women. Those poor women.
That is the real oversight in a lot of the records. Is nobody really talks about how the women feel about this, just that the men were quite annoyed.
But actually, just before we carry on, one of the interesting things about Pitcairn Island was that it didn't appear on charts. It was originally found by Polynesian seafarers centuries before any Europeans laid eyes on it. But basically, as the mutineers found, the island was just rich with everything you needed. It had fruit, it had meat, it had fresh water. It's basically a paradise, and it was discovered by the British in 1767 by the HMS Swallow, and the captain of the ship named the island after one of the Marines, who was Major Pitcairn. But when he went to record it on his chart, he mistakenly put it 300 kilometers in the wrong spot, which is why it didn't appear on any Royal Navy charts. And that's one of the key things to remember about the story, is that the Royal Navy came looking for these people, because when you screw over the Royal Navy, they won't forget. And they did. They looked, but because their charts were wrong, they didn't find the mutineers for a long time. And basically, the mutineers, as you mentioned, they arrive in, I think it's January 1790 on this island. They took Tahitian wives, and then they left the rest of the Tahitian men, but they still treated all the Tahitians almost like they were their own personal slaves. So it created a bunch of different tensions on the island.
So these tensions, they build up for a while, and eventually it kind of bubbles over. The Tahitian men group together and they decide they're going to attack the mutineers. So 6 mutineers are killed by the Tahitian men. 1 is drowned, apparently unrelated to the attack. And we end up with 1 survivor called John Adams. He's been quite a small player up until now. So it's interesting that of all these characters, he's the one who survives. And he continues to live on the island for 35 years. The capital of Pitcairn Island today is actually called Adamstown after him. And it is Adams who is found 18 years later when an American ship finds the island. And they speak to him, and he tells them the story of what happened.
Yeah, it is incredible, basically, for how long they went unnoticed, but also just this weird cycle of murder and revenge. It's almost like a mini civil war, not just between the Tahitians and the mutineers, but also mutineers themselves. And I think Fletcher Christian, there's conflicting reports about how he died. There's some that say he was murdered in his garden next to his pregnant wife. Others say he was murdered in his bed. So there's no concrete story of how he died. But yes, Adams was really the last survivor of the 15 men who had arrived to the island. The rest had obviously left on different islands or were left in Tahiti. And interestingly, today, Pitcairn Island is the last holding of the British Empire in the Pacific. Well, I say the British Empire, the Commonwealth. And geographically, it really is in the middle of nowhere. It's more than 3,000 miles from any continent, and it's not much bigger than Central Park in New York. And essentially, when this American ship discovers John Adams, it's really the start of another story of a sort of cycle of the island being abandoned and returned to, and relates to a cycle of overpopulation. So yeah, just over 20 years after the Americans discovered John Adams on this island, the remaining islanders resettled back on Tahiti. But they became so unsatisfied with life, and a few of them died because of the diseases they weren't used to, which they didn't have on the island where they came from. They moved back. And by 1855, you have the population growing to nearly 200. And I just couldn't sustain it. The island couldn't sustain its residents. So the Royal Navy had to then move the islanders to a former penal colony nearly 4,000 miles away. But within less than 2 years, at least around 20 had returned to the island. You just couldn't keep them away.
So in the present day, Pitcairn is also known for something slightly more tragic. in 2004, 6 men, at the time a third of the island's adult male population, including the mayor, were convicted of 33 sexual offences dating back as many as 40 years.
And it's obviously a very tragic chapter in the history of the island, but when you think back to how the island began, and it was basically a history of slavery and sexual abuse, it's almost like it's ingrained in part of the history of the island. And as you said, when the authorities finally came to interview these people, they focused, I think, around 19 to 20 men, and all the men kind of implicated themselves. They were kind of like a bit naive, a bit poorly educated, and they kind of didn't seem to think what they'd done was wrong in any way.
Yeah, so it's a sort of slightly tragic end, really, to the story. I mean, so that's kind of the story of the Bounty. I think there is a tendency to slightly romanticize the story. That the typical telling is that Bligh was a sort of oppressive captain, and Christian is this sort of heroic revolutionary type. Really, it's much deeper than that, and it's a much darker story in places.
Is it any less dark than, say, the Brothers Grimm or the fairy tales we tell our children? It's basically a story of people just fed up with life and wanting to live in their own fantasy world, and they basically got their own fantasy world handed on a plate to them, which they then proceeded to screw up by, abusing and torturing the people in their fantasy.
I think now is the point when we would traditionally speak about some interesting facts that we've found throughout our research.
So my fun fact is something we've alluded to throughout the podcast as well. And my fun fact is the story of the HMS Bounty, the mutiny itself, has inspired 5 movie versions, of which only one was a critical success. The rest were commercial flops. So the very first film made about it was an Australian film, which claims to be the first Australian film shot at sea, and that was in 1916. Then you have another sort of oceanic production, which stars Errol Flynn in his debut starring role, and he plays Fletcher Christian, and that was in 1933. Then you have, in 1935, Clark Gable playing Fletcher Christian. So no wonder we've kind of romanticized who Fletcher Christian was, if you've got all these amazing Hollywood actors playing him. And that film was the highest grossing film of the year, and it won an Oscar. And that's the only film that was a success. And then they made 2 more attempts to basically retell the story. In 1962, you had Mutiny on the Bounty, which starred Marlon Brando and Richard Harris. And it was just an utter disaster. It lost millions. And then finally, in 1984, you have Anthony Hopkins and Mel Gibson. Gibson obviously playing Fletcher Christian, the dashing rebel. And that failed to break even. It lost a couple of $1 million. It just wasn't commercially successful. Yeah, it's been a story that Hollywood wants to tell again and again, but really has only had one success.
My interesting fact is kind of expansion on yours. I'm kind of stealing your thunder a bit here, but the 1935 film was the only time in history that 3 actors in the same film were all nominated for Best Actor. It's the only time that's ever happened. None of them won it.
None of them won it.
Great. I mean, they only nominate 4. It was Clark Gable, Charles Loughton, who played Captain Bligh, and Franco Tone, who played Byam. I have not seen the 1935 version. I don't remember a Byam, but apparently he was very good, but not quite as good as Victor McLaglen, who was in The Informer.
I've not heard of either.
I'm assuming they don't mean the song by the rapper Snow.
You're far more knowledgeable about popular culture than me.
About bad 90s rap music. Shall we talk about myths that we've come up with, misconceptions about this story? There's quite a few of them, I think.
The one I was going to highlight was one that's we've kind of mentioned already, but basically in those star-studded Hollywood films we've just mentioned, the perception of Bligh is that he's a violent tyrant. He was actually less physically violent than other contemporary captains. We have it on record that he ordered fewer floggings of his men than any other British captain in the Pacific in the 18th century. So he's actually quite lenient. But as we've also mentioned, his abuse came in different forms. He was often threatening, used profanity, and he often lent money to people, but was kind of one of those people that would be like, here you go, here's a fiver, and then 2 minutes later, you got my fiver. If you got my fiver, can I have it back? So he's kind of one of those annoying individuals.
Yeah, so Bligh, he was kind of the Malcolm Tucker of 18th century captains.
Oh, but I like Malcolm Tucker. He's got charisma.
Oh, maybe not. I don't know. But yeah, on the topic of Bligh, my misconception is we've been talking about Captain Bligh for this whole podcast now, but really he was captain in name only. The Bounty was a class of ship known as a cutter, which was quite a small ship, and it was the rules at the time that the commanding officer of a cutter was not a captain; they were a lieutenant. So Bligh sailed as Lieutenant Bligh. He was referred to as Captain Bligh simply as a courtesy by his crew, and that's sort of carried on in the story. He did eventually reach the rank of Vice Admiral, but for his time on the Bounty, strictly speaking, he was Lieutenant Bligh. So those were our misconceptions for our episode on the Bounty. It'd be nice to think that we've perhaps managed to straighten that out a little bit, to some extent.
One can only hope.
One can only hope.
Unless all the information we read was completely wrong, but
that is
here's hoping it wasn't.
That is entirely possible.
If in doubt, go to Wikipedia.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we might as well call this this podcast
Wikipedia highlights.
Two guys read Wikipedia. So, on that note, what will I be typing into my Wikipedia search bar this week?
So, yes, you will be wikiing or Googling the 1904 Summer Olympics in St. Louis in the United States. And it's really quite fascinating. I'm not going to give too much away, but it was really one of those events in history that just, there's so many weird and crazy things that happen. You think, that can't be true.
Yeah, the 1904 Summer Olympics, that should be a good one. But with that, that's our podcast. Thank you for listening. We're on all the usual podcast platforms, so please subscribe in whichever way you prefer to subscribe to your podcasts. You can also contact us at info@thegallimaufry.show, and we'll see you again soon for another hodgepodge delve into history.
Brilliant, thank you.
Cool.
Take care.
See ya.